Hello everyone and welcome to this live webinar hosted by GEP. I'm delighted to be with you today. My name is Jamie Ogilvie-Smalls. I'm a Vice President and member of the Global Leadership Team at GEP, based in London. My role is primarily supporting Europe-based global clients. So GEP is very active in thought leadership for supply chain and procurement topics. Our publications can be found on our website, gep.com, our thought leadership app, GEP Go, which can be downloaded on the app stores, and also via our social accounts such as LinkedIn. And as part of this thought leadership, we publish 2 Outlook reports each year. One is the Supply Chain and Procurement Outlook, which provides insights on global trends. And the other is on the Outlook for 2022 in selected spend categories, which is what we'll be covering today. We're going to specifically focus on selected categories today, with subject matter experts talking about the key trends and risks in their specialist areas. And they'll also talk about the strategies that have helped us support our clients when dealing with the rapidly evolving landscapes in these categories. These insights should therefore help with other procurement leaders as they look to address their own challenges and opportunities in 2022. So in terms of the agenda, we'll start with a short introduction of GEP for those who are not aware of what we do and who we are. And then I'll pass to our category experts to deep dive into 4 categories today. As you can see, those are IT and telecoms, marketing, research and development, and also maintenance, repair and operations. Those are building on last week where we did a similar webinar in other categories, and we have a further one, the third of 3, next week if you'd like to cover other categories. And at the end of the session, we're going to have time for Q&A as well. So let me introduce the team for today. So we're going to start with Matthew Howland. He's going to cover the IT and telecoms category. Matty has 15 years of procurement and supply chain experience across a broad range of industry verticals. He's worked in procurement in many roles, really covering everything across operational S2P, strategic sourcing, category management, e-procurement and ERP implementations, and really working with leading client executives to advise on and pursue procurement maturity in their organizations. And Matty's based in the north of the UK. Then Catherine is going to cover marketing. She specializes in the marketing area, really looking at developing and implementing commodity strategies, managing partner agencies and developing sustainable sourcing practices for growth. Her background is in sports and entertainment, fashion, retail and FMCG. She's based in Amsterdam and is a senior category manager in GEP in the marketing area. Then Sally Mountain, who has a lot of experience, 25 years of experience in the pharma industry, and really for the last 15 years, heavily involved in global research and development. And that is her role within GEP. She's a specialist in this area. She's based in the UK. And then Abhinav will cover the MRO, maintenance, repair and operations category. Abhinav is based out of India. He's a senior director in our consulting practice, really responsible for leading large-scale procurement transformations and specializing in the MRO category as well. He's worked across many different industries, including pharma, automotive, mining, professional services, and so on. So we've got a great team for you today. And in terms of the structure, just to let you know that all of the attendees will have joined in listen-only mode. What we will ask you to do is think about your questions as you go. Feel free to add them into the chat. And then at the end of the session, we will start an open discussion across all of the categories at the end. And we'll also make copies of the presentation available to everyone after the webinar. So with that, just quickly to move on to, as I mentioned, the introduction to GEP before I hand over to Matty to start the first category. So just a brief introduction for those who don't know us well. So we are a leading global specialist in supply chain and procurement, working with around 500 customers and 6,000 employees over 24 offices globally, managing over 300 billion in spend annually on behalf of our clients. So we offer services in 2 areas in strategy, so really providing consulting services specialized in procurement and supply chain, as well as managed services where we run elements of procurement and supply chain functions for our clients. And we're also a technology company. We develop and run our own software platforms, including GEP Smart and GEP Next, which cover procurement and supply chain needs. And we're recognized as a leader by many reputable industry analysts such as Gartner, Forrester, etc. So that's the quick intro to GEP. And then with that done, I'm going to hand over to Matty, who's going to take us through the outlook for IT and telecoms. Over to you, Matty.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you very much for that introduction. Appreciate that. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. And I will be talking you through the category outlook for IT and telecoms for 2022. Okay, so in 2022, we are expecting the IT sector to return to a moderate level of growth. And we are seeing many of our clients focus on their change and transformation projects after working through many different types of reactive measures over the past couple of years. So when I say reactive measures, obviously throughout COVID, many organizations were forced to invest heavily in their IT estate to enable hybrid ways of working. Some of the main areas that we saw investment in over this period included network infrastructure and end user computing. So in particular, end user computing, where organizations didn't already have laptops distributed to all of their employees. So as organizations start to move past these reactive measures, they will start to develop longer term remote hybrid working strategies. And these strategies will have a direct impact on their IT service delivery models and the way that they deliver that service. We've seen that one of the priorities for some of the change projects is migrating to new technologies amongst some of our clients. And we've also seen that there is an extremely heavy demand for IT skilled resources. And alongside of that demand, we have observed a shortage in the market of those resources. So this is making it incredibly difficult for organizations to address their full project pipeline. And in a lot of cases, we're seeing them having to deprioritize some of these projects. So some organizations can look to their supply base to help execute some of these projects, which will contribute to a growing IT spend in the professional services category, which I will touch on in a few minutes when we discuss that subcategory in some more detail. So the first subcategory I'd like to discuss with you today is software. So as the IT sector returns to growth in 2022, we do feel that enterprise software will play the biggest part in and amongst the subcategories in terms of growth. And hopefully you can see the slide on the screen. If you just look to the chart in the top right hand corner, we can see there that overall, the share of spend that software holds within the information technology category, we are expecting that to increase to around 18% in the coming years. And actually, even a couple of years ago, software was still already a top segment for growth in terms of growth of subcategories. And collectively as a team, we have observed a direct correlation between recent global events and the need for new types of software. And in the enterprise context, most of those requirements are relating to productivity and performance tracking. So in the 2022 outlook, you will notice we've highlighted 4 segments in the software category where we feel as though there will be the most significant growth. So there are 4 in that report. For the purpose of the webinar today, I will bring up 2 of those for you. So the 2 that I will discuss now are low-code platforms and security software. So just to start with, low-code platforms, essentially they allow end users to become developers of digital products, things like websites and mobile applications. We continually see them growing in popularity, and we do expect over the next sort of decade that the spend on these platforms, third-party spend, is going to increase, and we expect those platforms to have a 30% share in the overall software subcategory. So it will be a substantial investment coming along in low-code platforms over the next decade. With regards to security software, usually this is installed on end user devices and it's coupled with physical and virtual hardware such as firewalls and cloud proxies. And we have seen an abundance of new entrants in this software market. And we believe one of the factors that's driven all of these new entrants was the move to hybrid working, and obviously the need for organizations to remotely verify their employee access and also to secure their workload depending on what they were working on. So that was an overview on the software subcategory, which is what we perceive to be the biggest area of growth for the category in 2022. Moving on from software, another big contributor to the moderate growth will be IT professional services, which I briefly touched on a moment ago when I was speaking about resource shortages in the market. So when we look at this subcategory as a whole, we are observing an all-time low in the availability of these skilled IT resources, and there are a number of factors contributing to this. So some of those factors include a smaller number of university graduates coming out of university with technology degrees. Another one is the smaller talent pool due to attrition rates being so high, and also the global restrictions that were imposed a couple of years ago that reduced freedom of movement and immigration. So a few factors there that have impacted this demand. We've also noticed that there is an intense rivalry in the market for these skilled resources. And usually it's the big tech companies that are the primary landing spot for these individuals. And the smaller non-tech related companies are really having to rely on their supply chain and their suppliers. And as a result, they're paying a premium for those. Another trend we're also witnessing, we're also seeing organizations start to accelerate their outsourcing initiatives with a particular focus on the non-core IT network, but we're also seeing them retain key strategic roles in-house. Some of those roles include architects, project managers, and governance experts. So that was an overview on IT professional services as a subcategory. Again, another one contributing to the growth in 2022. Moving on from professional services, I'll now talk a little bit about IT hardware. So IT hardware, it's not actually perceived to be a growth subcategory in 2022 due to a number of factors. So we've seen big changes in both corporate and consumer buying patterns over the past couple of years, largely due to lockdowns and remote working. But there's also been raw material shortages. We've seen natural disasters contributing to this, and as a result of those natural disasters, unforeseen shipping delays. So a number of factors, but we are now also starting to see organizations focus on the timing of their hardware purchases. So actually prioritizing the timing and as well as managing the demand and working on strategies to anticipate those delays in shipping. So we've seen a number of organizations pursuing large stock holdings via onshore and nearshore warehousing, and they're doing that both via going direct to the original equipment manufacturers, and they're also doing it through their value-added resellers. And this is allowing them to leverage bulk pricing while also mitigating the risks around the delayed shipping. So that's a good strategy to pursue in the hardware category on end user devices. Another strategy that can be pursued to mitigate the risks around that delayed shipping is upcycling, which is again another popular trend. Organizations can explore their value-added resellers upcycling capabilities and operations onshore to make sure that end user computing devices are being reused and components are being replaced where possible. So I've covered off three of the main subcategories there in the IT and telecoms category. So I've covered off software, hardware, and professional services. And the subjects that I've discussed today, they'll bring a number of challenges and opportunities for people to consider. So on the subject of enterprise software, seeing as we consider this one to be the biggest growth factor for 2022, I'd just like to make a number of recommendations to IT and procurement professionals in the coming year. So obviously as the spend and the demand increases for enterprise software, procurement professionals should anticipate a larger number of software-related sourcing projects in the pipeline. This will mean that it would be wise to plan your time effectively, because typically these large sourcing projects have more complexity, a much bigger cross-functional team involved in the selection of these suppliers and software, developing the requirements. There may be a focus on the resilience of the software deployment and the suppliers' information security practices if this software is being considered to be deployed in the cloud. So all sorts of reasons why it's very important to plan all of these projects in and make sure we time them correctly with renewals renewals that are expiring, or perhaps software that we're looking to sunset as part of the sourcing project. I would also recommend developing some sort of a balanced scorecard to evaluate these supplier offerings. And that will hopefully help. Once that scorecard's developed, it will mean less engagement and less time spent with key stakeholders, freeing up their time to sort of leave you to the sourcing process. It may also be wise to prepare for the learning curve. So it would be wise to familiarize yourself with the different operating models of software, platform, and infrastructure as a service, as more frequently we're seeing suppliers offer different types of operating models with their software offering. So it's quite important for procurement professionals to understand the difference and how that software is then managed post-selection. And I would also recommend that procurement professionals pay close attention to software functionality, because typically we see consolidation opportunities come up when we're looking for software. Quite often you see different software sourced by different departments when there was already a solution on the estate or deployed somewhere that could have been utilized. So if you pay really close attention to functionality requirements, then there should be good demand management opportunities to make sure that current solutions are utilized. So that was the category outlook for IT and telecommunications in 2022. I hope you have found the information discussed today useful. I will now hand over to my colleague, Catherine, and she will talk you through the marketing category outlook. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you, Matthew, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this webinar. So my name is Catherine Hilton, and I'm a Senior Category Manager for Marketing with GEP. As Jamie said in the introduction, I have 8.5 years experience in marketing procurement, and 3.5 of those years have been in consulting with GEP. My background's primarily in sports, fashion retail, and FMCG. So this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about the key trends in marketing procurement to look out for in 2022. And to begin with, I guess at the moment, we're all operating in a somewhat fluctuating environment, and the impact of the pandemic is still being felt on society, the economy, and ultimately consumer behaviour. Most recently, the rise in inflation has had a real immediate impact on the brand-consumer relationship. So the squeeze on cost of living is really focused brands to rethink everything from the products that they're advertising, the services that they're offering, the branding and the messaging. However, brands are continuing to invest during these difficult times and to address consumer needs. And the largest investment areas we're seeing are in MarTech, AI, and media. So the knee-jerk reaction that we've previously seen to cut advertising budgets that we've seen in the first and the second waves of the pandemic, we're realizing now is having a long-term detrimental impact on brand awareness, and it's ultimately damaging the share of voice in an already highly competitive market. And in some cases, the failure to invest during turbulent times is actually going to take years to recover from, and it's a slow process to get back into the market position that you were previously. And also on the top of everyone's agenda at the moment is ESG, and rightly so. We're seeing companies not only assessing their environmental impact on the planet, but also their responsibilities regarding diversity and inclusion. And advertising is a mechanism to launch new diversity initiatives, and brands are competing at the moment to establish themselves as the thought leaders in this space, to attract the best talent and to remain relevant. in a competitive market. This is leading to increased investments in internal comms as well as external PR. And I think we've seen Nike are proving to be the front runners in the sports world with backing diversity inclusion, and they're directly investing in women's sports at the moment and creating some fantastic content. So I would advise, if you're looking for an example of a brand who are really embracing inclusion and diversity, to have a look at the materials that Nike are producing at the moment. So with all this flux, how is it affecting procurement and marketing procurement? Well, we're seeing a reshaping of the traditional creative and production agency roles. And as Matthew was mentioning in IT, talent retention within the creative industry is also particularly challenging at the moment. So there are a high number of vacancies with the larger networks. It's actually at an all-time high in order to retain and attract talent, with people working remotely and globally, demanding higher salaries and more flexible working conditions. Ultimately, these components push the costs of agencies up, and this gets passed on to the client. And on the flip side of that coin, we're also seeing the adaptive digital content thriving, and the availability of digital workflows and creative tools that is actually reducing the reliance and the need to go to an agency for your entire ecosystem in creation and production. So companies are investing in DAMs, they're investing in CGIs and various cloud-based technologies to allow in-house capabilities to be built up, and also to work primarily with agencies, but we're seeing a real flourish in build once, use many. And how we would recommend progressing in this environment at the moment is to stabilize your existing agency relationships, because ultimately you do need talent and you do need external expertise in this area, whether it's concept, brand, or production. So make sure that SRM program is in place, that you are getting value for money, and that you're reassessing what you're using your agency for, because future-proofing your strategy, I think, is the key in this area. So really questioning, when do you need that external talent? Where can you in-house? So further down the line, is in-housing or partial in-housing of some of these operations and activities an option for your business? And the way that you can actually understand that fully, or the impact of that fully, is to assess the total cost of ownership for your creation campaigns and your advertising campaigns. And I'd like to highlight this as a key example of where the procurement strategy and the marketing procurement strategy should really be in sync with the marketing strategy. And any operation model change that you're proposing should be incorporated into a mid to longer term strategic planning. So working with your stakeholders to make sure that your strategies are not conflicting, but they are aligning. And continuing on the theme of digital transformation, so we know digital transformation is continuing to accelerate with increased technology and data investments to support digital and e-commerce activity. And this is a trajectory that's only going to increase. So MarTech budgets we've seen have increased on an average of 8% in 2021, which is a high investment area for many brands at the moment. And brands are really interested in automating the customer buying journey, and they're doing this through an omni-channel approach that's personalized. And what this is about is connecting individuals at the right time, at the right place, with the right content or the right offer, ultimately leading to more conversions and customer loyalty. So this omni-channel approach and this end-to-end customer journey, it's not just about attracting new customers, it's not just about acquisition, it's also about client retention and ensuring brand loyalty. And this is where we see AI coming into the forefront. So it's continuing to create new opportunities for task automation, for campaign optimization, reducing costs and improving quality. And what it really does fundamentally is reduce the speed to market. So from creation to activation, you're removing the human element, which is really reducing a cost to serve model. However, human centricity still is central to the design of customer experience and new product development. and there is a downside to AI. So if it is done badly or incorrectly, it does have a negative impact. And some people listening to this may recall Microsoft's attempt to create a more relatable chatbot, which they programmed to essentially speak like a teenager, or it tried to speak like a teenager. And as you can imagine, that created a whole host of problems. The developments in tech and the growing demand for data insights is also having a significant benefit for procurement. So attribution modeling and data ownership is allowing procurement and finance to discuss with marketing how to make informed investment decisions. And what's great for procurement here is that it can really focus on the priorities of the business, which contracts and which areas are returning more investment and are revenue drivers. We can also use this data to start to hold agencies accountable to predefined KPIs, especially in the digital marketing space, where previously we would be completely reliant on the agency to provide management information. Owning your own data, having that visibility and transparency is really allowing for us to make our partners accountable, and also informing where the money should be spent and where investments should be continued to be made. A procurement tip in this area, I think one of the emerging trends here is that commercial structures and agreements are migrating more towards a software as a service model rather than a traditional agency-based model. And in this sense, we need to kind of go back to basics in terms of engaging with IT. And Matthew touched upon this as well. We need to assess the IT infrastructure and landscape that you're proposing to bring your new MarTech solution into. There could be a solution that already exists. There could be a partner provider in the IT space who's also developed the capability to do what your proposed supplier is going to do. And I would also say here, really check the small print and don't sign up to longer term deals, even if they are offering a significant discount and perceived better value for money. We know that requirements are constantly changing in this area. So unless your contract is very flexible, I would err towards the side of shorter term engagements and also ensuring that pilots are in place and have successfully been completed before signing up for longer term arrangements. So finally, I'm going to move on to media. And at the moment, it's hard to even mention the word media without mentioning the word inflation. They seem to be going hand in hand at the moment. And the headline really in this sense is that you can't solve inflation. You can only adapt to the situation that you're presented with. And we've seen here that brands with high investments in media across multiple media channels have a better chance at maintaining conversion rates than those who don't invest during high and fluctuating inflation levels. So by de-investing or reducing your media budgets during times of inflation, this can actually lead to a longer term base sales decline. And some of the research we're seeing in this space is suggesting that that decline can be up to 10%. So it's very significant. Having said that, the way you can manage this and mitigate this is to adjust the media mix to reflect the change in your customers' habits and purchase journeys. So you're renegotiating deals that are reflecting your consumers' media consumption patterns. And the way to do this, the best way to do this is to work with your media partner. So for the majority, the most effective way to buy media is through an agency who is part of a network, who is competing against another network. And that's essentially how you do get the best value rather than trying to negotiate these deals with networks outside of an agency. Having said that, your agency relationship is fundamental in this sense. So SRM is the best way to address the rise in inflation here and to work with your agency to limit the amount of inflation that you're experiencing in your media plans. You need to do this by ensuring that you have a beneficial contract, a mutually beneficial contract, and transparency. You can also discuss inflation forecasts, and these should be mutually shared and something that your agency should be happy to provide you with their outlook on certain channels. Where procurement can really step in and support is to establish relevant, robust and measurable KPIs, and ensure that dynamic commercial models are put in place in order to achieve these targets. And when I'm talking about dynamic commercial models, I'm talking about gain share incentives, performance-based bonus or performance-based remuneration structures. And these should be aligned by the company's growth targets, by ROIs, KPIs, and be measurable, mutually agreed and trackable, because it's one thing to set the targets, it's another thing to measure the targets. So you need to make sure that you have that proactive relationship to make sure that these KPIs are being met. And also be mindful that you may actually have to pay higher prices given the current state of the market. But these also need to be offset by the ROI and the growth targets of the business. So the idea would be not to retract from these channels, but to make sure that you're investing with an informed decision and seeing the benefits of that investment. So I've gone through quite a lot this afternoon. And the key takeaways I would say from this section is, one, to be flexible. So we're in a state of flux at the moment, and the procurement strategy really needs to align with the marketing strategy. We need to be able to react to certain situations and not tie ourselves into longer term commitments that we may need to get out of if the economy changes, if inflation drops, etc. And then we know that there are growth areas. So focus on the growth areas of MarTech, software as a service, AI, and familiarize yourselves with more of IT-based agreements than traditional agency model agreements. And also with media. So have a look at your media contracts, open up what you can and renegotiate the areas that you're actually going to plan to spend in 2022. And then finally, and fundamentally, it's about working collaboratively with key agencies. So make sure the focus is on value for money, KPIs that are measurable and that are transparent, and a return on investment. And use that return on investment to forecast against inflation. So you know that the channels that you're investing in are the channels that you're seeing a tangible return on. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time and your attention. And I'll pass you over to my colleague, Sally, who's going to talk to you about research and development. Thank you.
In R&D procurement, as Janie mentioned earlier. So I'm going to take you through the key trends and outlook for 2022 for the R&D category, focusing mainly on the pharma industry. So in 2022, post-pandemic, R&D leaders and R&D procurement heads, as with other sectors of business, have been in risk management and resilience mode to protect the business, to protect the customers, protect the patients, and in fact, the whole enterprises. There's a high level of vulnerability in the supply chain, stressed and stretched really due to the overwhelming demand from the healthcare sector, which became in competition with the pharma and clinical research sector during the pandemic. So this has caused, in some cases, breaks in the supply chains, shortages of materials, and competition for skilled resources, combined with continued advances in technology. So over the next few minutes, I'll take you through these trends. So combining COVID with technological advances allowed more patient centricity. And through that, it's really important for procurement to be involved in pipeline planning and demand management as early as possible with the stakeholders. And also to have good relationships with the suppliers, because with all the increased competition, the important thing is to ensure that you have the resources to run the trials. So the digital capabilities have been increasing. Obviously, we've been all used to cloud computing, And there's been investment in AI and machine learning, allowing predictive modelling. And the use of blockchain has increased. In the manufacturing of the medication, it allows a robust way to find that you're not going to have counterfeits, which has happened in the market in the past. And also, for example, with patient confidentiality, blockchain can prove that the patient confidentiality was done at the right time. And then if there's updates to protocols, for example, reconsent can happen at any point, and everybody can see that this has happened when it should have done. The increase in wearables and smart technologies has allowed access to real-time data on a wide scale. Many years ago, when EDC first came about, people were talking about direct data capture in the future, and we're here now in 2022, and the use of wearables has grown considerably. So with the increase in technology and the situation with the pandemic, it meant that many patients could not attend clinics for clinical trials. And this led to a wider growth in decentralized clinical trials. Because of the technology, it enabled patients then to be more diverse, perhaps have access to trials that didn't have before because they have the means didn't have the means to go and visit the doctors in the hospitals or surgeries as often as necessary. They may not feel that they want to, but with the decentralized clinical trials, they now can be seen at home for some of the visits. Now that has then meant that the direct-to-patient offering for the medication has to happen, so the logistics is a challenge for that, and the confidentiality again. And then there's been a growth in home nursing around clinical trials. Some of these things were already in existence, but they've accelerated. So that meant, okay, you've got the technology, but now you've got more services involving more people and more complex logistics. Couple that with trying to be sustainable and look at how to reduce carbon footprint. One of the things that procurement can help with is how to have reduce the wastage. The wastage, for example, with too big an overage of lab kits, too big an overage of drug supply. So working with the stakeholders closely and the suppliers to have a right size. You always would need some overage, but in some cases it can be excessive. And in these times where there's competition, it's actually been quite difficult for some pharma companies to continue the clinical trials with having, say, lab kits from their regular supplier or their regular central lab. So that's meant more diversification of suppliers. In the past, there's been a big move for consolidation and trying to reduce the tail spend and concentrate on main preferred suppliers. But because of the broken supply chains, this has meant the diversification and a change from offshoring to nearshoring in some cases, so that you've got more local, more nimble access to suppliers. And then, of course, with the pandemic again, the increase in disposables has caused issues around competition for supply. So again, risk management and contingency planning are very important in this case, and procurement can help considerably with that. Coupled with all that, obviously it's a highly regulated environment, and the regulations are always changing, adding to the burden or complexity. For example, the medical device regulations, 2017-745, for example, if you're looking at ancillary supplies that are now being considered as devices because they're involved with touching the patient, then it may be a good idea to not write a particular model or a particular make into a protocol, which I have seen happen. And then that causes an issue if a particular model isn't actually registered in the countries in which you're doing the trials. And what has been seen is that not even all the big manufacturers are registering all their models in all the countries at once. They're actually quite slow on the uptake, so that adds to the complexities. And again, procurement can help with the relationships with the suppliers, or perhaps looking at new suppliers to identify how to fill those gaps. And again, as with everybody, the shortage of skilled labour, skilled resources to run the trials means that early engagement is really important with the stakeholders and the suppliers to secure the resources that you need to continue running the trials. The sustainability and ESG in procurement and supply chain are very big in pharma. It was an industry that was seen as very heavy on resource and potentially environmentally damaging, and great strides have been made in terms of looking at ESG, environmental, social and governance, and sustainability as a whole. And all companies are working towards net zero, some faster than others, and it's maybe easier to look upstream within their organisations at how they can reduce carbon emissions, as it's harder perhaps to look downstream to how products and services are used. One of the things that's important as well, and again where procurement can help, is not just looking at the suppliers, but the suppliers' suppliers, and having a good overview on those ESG sustainability goals. Some companies have moved to green labs, for example, and looking at novel ways to look at the use of instruments and equipment where there's been in prior times a heavy use of disposables, and of course with the pandemic an even higher use of disposable equipment, to whether you can work with instruments that can be reused, obviously being sterilised, etc., but and novel ways to look at that. With the changes in technologies, the changes in the models, new KPIs and KQIs might be needed to be found as well. One of the things that's really important is that the procurement team can help with identifying new suppliers. Say, if your supply chain is broken and with a long supply chain, you need to diversify and look at more localised. With PPE, for example, the UK tried to buy en masse for the whole of the NHS. In Germany, a lot of localisation occurred because individual hospitals or trusts were able to go and buy themselves, and the localisation has helped. So that is a big change to the past. So I'd say reducing waste, reducing materials, procurement can help at looking at how the organisations and the suppliers can work together to reduce wastage. Market dynamics is very complicated right now in Europe, of course, with the geopolitical situations. So it remains an important market, but it's a complex market compared to the US, which is still the largest single market, and Asia Pac, which is a growing area, the fastest growing market. I would say that it would be important to understand that it isn't possible to equal the US in the way that Europe operates, even though the EU has standardization. For example, again, with the medical device regulations, there's an EU directive, but some countries are going further to tighten regulations themselves. And because of the complexities of the rest of the world, a major pharma company has reorganized to be US-centric and then count the whole of the rest of the world as one. So sort of two main divisions, a US and rest of the world. So to help with the pipeline planning and demand management in these inflationary times, procurement can look to negotiate the best possible deals or partnerships with the suppliers. The savings may still be there, but of course inflation has to be taken into account, whereas in previous times you may have been able to reduce the amount that was sort of built into contracts. So if you've got the relationships with suppliers where they can do good forecasting and have a stable group of employees, then it may be easier to follow that trend. So these are really the main points for R&D. The high level of collaboration with the stakeholders and innovative suppliers. In R&D, of course, it's very necessary for the R&D procurement to keep up to date with the scientific innovations. So, for example, going from tumours, getting biomarker samples from tumour blocks to dry spot, to being able to have liquid biopsies with circulating tumour cells and so on, looking at advances all the time. So whilst you still have an element of consolidation, diversification has to happen to keep up to date with the science and technology. So I think that's about all I have to say for now. And I would like to thank you and hand over to Abhinav, who'll talk about MRO.
Thank you, Sally, for those useful insights. Hello, everyone. I will cover the MRO trends and the outlook. My name is Abhinav Gupta. Just a quick introduction. I have 13 years of procurement experience. I've done a lot of MRO procurement over the years in different industries and different regions. At GEP, I also lead the Global MRO Category Advisory Group, which is a team of very experienced subject matter experts and thought leaders across the all the regions in the company. Prior to GEP, I was working as an operations and maintenance engineer in the shipping industry in the early years of my career. So my exposure to MRO starts there, and then I continued at GEP in terms of my procurement experience. So I'll cover MRO. From an MRO perspective, I will cover, Sarah, if you could go to the next slide, please. Great, thanks. So I will cover three broad trends in MRO. The first is the inflation challenges that we are seeing. The second is the technology trends. And the third is the sustainability trend. So I'll talk about each of these. And then once we have spoken about the trends, I will talk about some of the recommendations and practical strategies that procurement professionals can use to navigate the very unique environment we are in right now, and also what they can do to leverage the opportunities which are there. So let me talk about these trends first. As far as inflation is concerned, just a little bit of historic perspective. At the peak of COVID, we have seen significant demand reductions, demand drop. And then as the impact of the pandemic started recovering in the last 3-4 quarters, we saw a resurgence in demand, but the supply has not kept up so far. So it's a little bit of a flip of the situation from the demand drop to a supply side issues now happening in the last few quarters. So The commodity prices have been very high in the recent past. We have seen increases in almost all input materials for MRO components, especially so for steel and other commodities. Yes, for steel, we have seen a little bit of cooling off in the recent past, but still the price levels are significantly higher, for example, from early 2021. And these high price levels will continue to drive the high pricing for MRO components. Labor shortages and wage rate increases. In Europe, in particular, we have seen significant, workforce shortages, and especially for the blue collar workers in 2021. In 2021, we have seen some of the highest labor cost spikes in some countries compared to, since 2009. This shortage has been caused by increased demand for workers, which is driven by the relatively sharp economic rebound, coupled with depleted labor supply following movement of population within European countries in the aftermath of the pandemic. For UK in particular, this is also compounded by stricter immigration laws following Brexit. So high labor costs, and we expect this to continue throughout 2022. High shipping and logistics charges, both for land transportation and ocean transportation. This is also contributing to price inflation. And raw material shortages. We have seen a lot of raw material shortages, and they are expected to continue in the future as well. So all of these factors have led to significant price inflation for both maintenance supplies and maintenance services. For many MRO items, we have seen double-digit percentage price increases in the last few quarters, which is very high. Now, in terms of our outlook on this, prior to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, our outlook was that these inflation trends will continue until the end of 2022, but their severity will keep reducing through the course of the year. But with the crisis in Europe ongoing, we might see these trends continuing even for a longer period. So that's on the inflation challenges. Talking about technology trends, there are a number of technology trends which were there pre-pandemic, and the work from home and the remote working during the pandemic has only hastened the adoption of certain technologies. So, for example, smart technologies and 3D printing and IoT sensors, all of these were there, but there has been an accelerated adoption of these during the course of the pandemic. Similarly, we are also seeing increased usage of e-marketplace and e-commerce platforms. So it is there, and we expect to see continued adoption of these technologies and trends in 2022 and 2023. Now, as a result of these trends, we are also seeing that suppliers are evolving their offerings and solutions in line with these trends. They want to be ahead of the curve compared to their competition to ensure that they are retaining market share and growing market share. So suppliers are rapidly, responding to these technology trends as well. Sustainability trends. We all know in Europe and globally, there is a strong focus on sustainability in organizations, small and large alike. And we expect to see an increased use of green solutions by both MRO customers and MRO suppliers going forward, like the use of refurbished components, use of more energy efficient solutions, for example. So that's on sustainability. So these were some of the broad trends that I wanted to talk about from an MRO perspective. Now we will switch over to talk about some of the recommendations and strategies that MRO procurement teams can use. So first of all, in terms of dealing with inflation, some of the advice that from a GP perspective we are giving to our clients and implementing for our clients is, one, stronger supplier relationship management with your key MRO suppliers. That's very important, so that those suppliers are incentivized to provide optimal service levels and pricing, so that those suppliers are treating you as their priority customers. So stronger SRM, renewal and extension of existing good quality contracts. If such contracts are there, it is advisable to renew or extend for 6 months to 1 year. We think that this is not the greatest of time to go out to market for new sourcing events. So it will be useful to postpone go-to-market activities to late 2022, early 2023 as well. From a demand management perspective, demand management becomes even more important in this environment than normal circumstances because of the high prices. A lot of the cost reductions are going to come from demand management activities. And one example I can give in that context is teams may benefit from postponing any non-critical maintenance activities to later in the year or early next year. If they are non-critical, it makes sense to not do those right now when the pricing is so high. Another very important strategy for addressing this is particularly for your high spend items and high runner items, it may be useful to work with the suppliers to identify alternative items and substitutes which are lower priced and replace your current items with those lower price substitutes as long as they are having the same functionality as your current items. That's a very important strategy, and suppliers can help you with that. But having said that, for the other lower value items, etc., if the price increases are inevitable, it is fine to agree to those price increases as long as the suppliers are providing adequate justification, sufficient justification for those price increases, and while ensuring that those price increases are in line with the inflation trends and they are not higher than what the inflation is dictating, right? It's also a good opportunity to reinforce some of the supplier continuous improvement commitments, so that suppliers are, they have the mandate to work with customer teams to implement customer continuous improvement initiatives. So that's a good one. Also, it's a good opportunity to agree on building commodity index-based pricing mechanisms in the contracts if they are not there already, right? Because there may still be future price increases, and it's good to have those index-based mechanisms or pricing formula in place in the contract, so the pricing can be tagged to those. Another small tip I would give is it's useful to introduce price bands in the contracts, in the sense that we could say that if the pricing from here changes by, say, plus minus 5% in a band, the pricing will not be actually changed. It will only change if those limits are exceeded, right? What this will do is it will reduce the administrative workload of having to change prices very often. And also, if the prices are increasing, the suppliers will be able to absorb some of the price increases until it hits that cap that you have defined, the plus minus X% that you have defined. So that's another small tip I wanted to share here. Now, in terms of moving on to technology trends, leveraging technology trends, I would say that MRO end users, maintenance teams, procurement teams should look at making a strong push for predictive maintenance, for the use of smart technologies wherever possible. I'll give a couple of examples. Using sensors with forklifts and cranes, that's very useful. It allows you to monitor the condition of those equipment and defining the time when you should do any maintenance work. Another example, industrial cleaning. There could be use of 2D, 3D nozzles. You could also use more automation in some of these activities, so as to really reduce the reliance on manual intervention. Also, because of the increased labor rates, it would help there. We just talked about the labor rates a few minutes earlier. So those are some technology-related points. Also, for purchasing teams, it may be useful to explore the use of e-marketplace and e-commerce platforms, particularly for low-value, non-contracted MRO items. It's a very useful channel for that kind of MRO requirement. Yes, it is clear that the e-marketplace platforms are not equally evolved in all countries. They are not equally evolved in all regions, but those countries where they have good capability, they have a good product footprint, it does make a lot of sense to explore what they have to offer and use some of those channels. It brings in efficiencies, etc. So it will further streamline your MRO purchasing. So those are some of the technology trends and opportunities that I wanted to suggest. From a sustainability perspective, I would suggest that procurement teams should actively incorporate sustainability requirements in their supplier evaluations. This is becoming a more and more important area for for leadership, for management, for external reporting. So it's useful to evaluate suppliers on that. In terms of some of the solutions that can be implemented to improve the carbon footprint, and so on. One, use of refurbished components like refurbished valves and refurbished pump parts, etc. This is a great idea because one, you are not utilizing the material that goes into manufacture of new parts, and at the same time, so that reduces the carbon impact. And at the same time, this comes with a lot of cost reduction. From what I've seen in some of the projects, we can expect anywhere from 30 to 50%, sometimes even 60% cost savings by using refurbished parts instead of new parts. So that's one suggestion. Similarly, deployment of higher energy efficiency equipment and solutions. That's a great idea. It reduces energy consumption, it reduces cost. I'll give one example here. Electric motors. Our analysis says that of the total life cycle cost of running an electric motor through its lifespan, about 70%, up to 70% is the cost of the energy consumed in the running of the motor. That's a big number. And by moving from standard motors to higher energy efficiency motors, there could be significant cost savings given that high number of the energy cost in the total life cycle cost. So again, it has a dual benefit. It reduces your energy consumption, which has a direct impact on your carbon footprint. And at the same time, you are able to save significant cost by switching out to these high energy efficiency motors. And there are many other examples of this kind where these creative ideas can be implemented for improving cost as well as sustainability performance. So those are some of the suggestions and recommendations I wanted to make for MRO. I'll pause here. Thanks everyone for joining and listening in. I'll now turn it over back to Catherine. She will lead the question and answers. There are some questions which would have come from the audience, and she will pose those questions to the panelists here, and we will answer those. So over to you, Catherine.
Great, thank you, Abhinav, and thank you to all the speakers. I think hopefully we've all learnt something new this afternoon. I certainly have. As Abhinav mentioned, we've been collecting your questions throughout the presentations, and I'm just going to pick a few and direct them to the team here. So the first one is in relation to IT. So Matthew, this is a question for you. What are the biggest cost reduction opportunities organisations should explore in 2022? And that's for IT.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, so I would recommend pursuing cost reduction opportunities in 2022. I think the top one that I would recommend would be for organisations to look to third parties for support on software infrastructure. There are a lot of third-party options out there now for lots of the big original equipment manufacturers, lots of the big enterprise resource planning software providers, and it has to be done on a risk-based basis, and obviously you have to get legal advice. But there are really large savings opportunities by moving over different levels of support, different parts of support for your IT estate to a third party, and in some cases you actually you increase the quality of the support. So some of the third party providers provide better levels of support, quicker service level agreements, enhancements on break fix for hardware. So in some cases you can improve the level of support and reduce the amount you are paying. So I would highly recommend organisations consider third-party support across their IT estate instead of using the OEMs.
Great, thank you for that. And we have a marketing question next. So is AI affecting any other areas other than content in marketing? The short answer is yes. If we could actually do a whole another webinar on this topic, but one that springs to mind, a real opportunity area is in in-store marketing, and especially in shop marketing, in-store personnel. So the composition at the moment for in-store expense, it's around 70% is labour and overhead costs. And what we can do, or what brands are continuing to do, is investigating the use of a hybrid solution to have a virtual in-store assistant, some AR or even hologram technology, to be able to reduce that in-store presence. And the benefits of this are obviously that artificial intelligence can capture infinite amounts of data about your product offering. It can also be programmed for various language capabilities, demographic capabilities, in order to interact with the consumer at a really personal level, which again enhances that personalized customer experience. And obviously it has a cost saving implication as well. So up to 40%, you can see 40% reduction in some areas where you're removing up to 50% of your in-store sales teams. And now another benefit of this is you can use an in-store provider, a virtual in-store provider, to collect first-party consumer data. And one of the struggles we're experiencing in marketing is how you can collect third-party data, especially under the new data protection legislation, which is making this increasingly difficult. So by having an interactive, submersive experience in the store, you're actually allowing customers to give consent to passing on their data. You can capture all their preferences. So it's also a hybrid between a shopping assistant and a market intelligence or a market research tool as well. So hopefully that has answered that question. And moving on to R&D, one for Sally. Do you see a return to have more clinical trials designed to run by the traditional methods post-pandemic?
Thank you, Catherine. I'd say no. Going back to about 2009, 2010, there was a particular trial with some very ill oncology patients who were having difficulties getting into the hospital for certain visits. And then we did an arrangement where a courier, obviously with confidentiality in place, would actually take the medication to the patients, and the nurse would visit for the examinations and so on, and taking their bloods. And so that was back then, but it wasn't mainstream. And I'd say the growth in decentralized clinical trials with the direct-to-patient offering and home nursing will only increase. At the moment, there's 65,000 recruiting trials and 18,000 registered that are not recruiting. 2,000 of those are listed with remote home visits and telemetry. 600 are listed with wearable technologies, 30 as decentralized clinical trials, only 2 so far with blockchain-based platforms. But all those are an increase on what's been seen, I'd say, pre-pandemic. So now that everybody's got used to that, I think it will continue to grow rather than shrink back to the normalized clinical trials. It's now the new normal.
Great, thanks for that, Sally. And I'm going to throw another one back to Matthew. What are the savings opportunities for software in 2022?
So, thank you, Catherine. So, with regards to software, I think I've discussed this a little bit earlier on when I was talking through the outlook. So, obviously, it's very important for procurement professionals to make sure that they have a high quality, up-to-date pipeline of procurement engagements with a particular focus on software, because all of the software renewals are time driven and time bound. Typically barriers to change are quite high with software. So it's not very often you come across a stakeholder that's willing to consider some sort of a market scan to look for alternatives. I would maybe say 20% of software projects you can turn into a sourcing project, and you can look for alternatives in the market. But I would say that the biggest opportunities for software savings is for procurement professionals to make sure that you're working with your stakeholders to accurately manage the demand. Make sure that you have a thorough understanding of the commercial model. Is it a license-based model? Are we consuming these software licenses in some shape or form? How does the commercial model work? And just make sure that you're reaching out to your stakeholders with adequate timing to make sure that whichever commercial model is utilized in the individual software, make sure that that demand is being managed, the requirements are accurate, and where appropriate, we consider transacting that through a value-added reseller to reduce the number of suppliers that you have in your overall tail of suppliers. So those are the areas where I would look for savings on software.
Great, thank you for that. And one for Abhinav. So we see many times that high quality MRO sourcing doesn't necessarily convert into actual benefits due to compliance issues. What would your suggestion be for ensuring that benefits of strategic sourcing and preferred contracts are fully realized?
That's a great question. It's a very regular pain point that we see with companies also. A few things I would say on that is once MRO contracts are in place, then through policy and process and tool, it is very important to drive compliance to preferred contracts and preferred suppliers. For stock items, it is important to upload all the negotiated pricing from these sourcing events into ERP systems so that they can then enable MRP runs. For the non-stock items, there should be a strong push for maximum possible catalog implementation and channeling the relevant spend to the catalogs or through the catalogs. Teams can also use a guided buying tech system, which would automatically direct users to the right buying channel, be it catalogs or marketplaces, etc. Now, in environments where the tech and automation is not very advanced, at least teams should use category cards so that those category cards can be given to the ordering teams and they can rely on those category cards for their ordering activities, and they are following the chosen suppliers and following the pricing that has been put in place with them. Another thing I would say is strong SRM. It's important to have ongoing SRM reviews with suppliers to ensure that they are compliant to the agreed KPIs and the agreed pricing. So those are some of the suggestions I would give for that question. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Abhinav. And we'll move on to another marketing question. So how can you mitigate the cost of print and point of sale given the increasing costs of raw materials? Again, this is a very relevant topic because, as we all know, there are many components that build up print and POS, and it incorporates many different aspects of supply chain. So you're going from the raw product to the production, to the transportation, to the storage, and then the final destination. And in point of sales displays, you've also got that merchandising and installation element, which again is another labor cost. So my advice would be to really have a look at your supply chain and identify the components of the production from start to finish. Consolidation is always the first point of call here. So look at collaborating with a managed service provider who can facilitate that end-to-end production, manufacturing and delivery. And I would also say really have a look at the amount of SKUs that you're producing and the type of materials that you're using, because there are always alternatives in the market, especially point of sale display. There's lots of different, more sustainable, carbon friendly ways to produce display units and furnitures. If you can standardize and reduce those, that in itself will bring a natural cost reduction. So you're not looking at decreasing inequality, but what you're doing is focusing on a standard set of POS, a standard set of print, and then customizing that rather than trying to create multiple unique SKUs. So hopefully that will give you some food for thought there. And another one for you, Sally. R&D, do you know if any pharma or chemical companies are aiming for net zero transmissions before 2030?
Thank you, Catherine. AstraZeneca, Merck, Novartis are all aiming for reducing or eliminating their carbon emissions from their operations by around 2025. But I think the only one that's aiming to go beyond carbon neutral is AstraZeneca, who are aiming to be carbon negative by 2030. Thank you.
Okay, good to know. And another one for Abhinav. Let me find this one. Okay. I am in preliminary stages of my MRO strategy development, and what would your guidance be for me for an effective strategy development?
Thanks, Catherine. That's a great question too. MRO is a vast and complicated category, and with a large number of components and product types, it could be very daunting when you are getting started with your MRO strategy development. Our approach at GEP and what we recommend to our clients and do for them when we are working with them is whenever we are starting with this strategy development, we take the entire MRO spend profile and we segregate into three major broad buckets, which we call as commodity, specialty, and OEM. Now, this is based on the level of competition available in the supplier market. So commodity is all your nuts, bolts, industrial supplies, bearings, PP, those items which a lot of suppliers can provide, a large number of suppliers can provide. At the other end of the spectrum is the OEM parts, which are very proprietary, and it's almost impossible to induce any competition there. And in between the two is the specialty items, where substitution is not impossible, it is possible. And there are a few suppliers, but it's not like commodity where there is a large pool of suppliers and you can substitute very easily. These are more specialized components, and the number of suppliers available is smaller. So what we do is, and some examples of these specialty components would be gearboxes, specialty filters, electronics and instrumentation. So we take the entire spend and segregate into these three broad buckets based on the competition and the nature of the supplier market. And after that, we develop customized strategies for each of these, right? And we determine what is the right supply-based engagement model for each of these three buckets. So it's a very long discussion to say how do we develop a MRO category strategy, but I just wanted to give some overall indicators as to how we approach an MRO spend and go about defining this strategy. So
well, the follow-up question to that was, will you write my strategy for me?
Certainly, for sure. Feel free to reach out through the GEP website, or my email ID is abhinav.gupta@gep.com. We will be more than happy to engage with you and write it for you.
Thank you, Abhinav. So another IT one for Matthew. So what steps can procurement professionals take to improve the resilience and stability of hardware supply with the global disruption occurring at the moment?
Thanks, Catherine. So with regards to hardware supply, so I think I touched on this earlier as well. Two things. I think the first thing would be explore a value-added reseller's capabilities in this space. So have a look to see, have a look at the value-added reseller market. Think about which suppliers you are using. If you're not using one, then this could be a good opportunity. Value-added resellers are managing a lot of different organizations, desktop estates, end user computing devices. A lot of original equipment manufacturers directly endorse them for reuse and recycle services. A lot of them have large warehouses where they have a constant influx of IT equipment and distribution. There could be warehousing opportunities. There could be areas where you can focus on particular areas of hardware which are really struggling for supply at the moment. Different types of devices. So definitely explore a value-added reseller's capability if you're not already using one. And then the second one would be with regards to the specification of end user devices. So I would recommend getting involved with the stakeholders and trying to understand how you can get some early involvement into the way that the laptop builds and the end user devices are specified. Because if you can bring some supplier involvement into that specification, then you might be able to contribute supplier expertise. They might be able to give you advice on different components that are really struggling with lead times at the moment. They might be able to tell you which parts and stock they have in abundance, which would help reduce mitigate the risks around long lead times. So those are the two main areas I would say: value-added reseller exploration and trying to influence the specification of the devices.
Thanks, Matthew. I'm also wondering, Abhinav, is that something that's affecting MRO, the availability of hardware and machinery and equipment, given the disruption to global supply chains and the importation of these machines?
Yes, it is a hardware in a totally different sense when we say hardware as industrial supplies and other MRO supplies. There have been supply chain disruptions in some geographies more than in others, and some of the measures that could be taken to ensure that continuity of supply and item availability, which is paramount for continuity of production, are one, find backup suppliers. Right, we generally push for more and more consolidation, but this is the environment where you would want to have some backup suppliers so that you can lean on them if your main suppliers are running into some issues. Nearshoring also for geographies like Europe and North America, if some of the MRO supplies of the organizations are coming from other regions like APAC, then it could be a little risky with transportation disruptions, etc. So it is advisable that local suppliers which are closer to you are evaluated and they are kept as in the mix as backup suppliers at least. I would also say just 2-3 more points on that. It may be useful to adjust the inventory levels, the min-max inventory levels, because we know that lead times sometimes have increased. There could be disruptions. So in order to not run out of critical items, the inventory levels could be revisited. Supply relationships, again, very, very important to have stronger communication and interaction with the suppliers and make a push for understanding their lead times and understanding what is their supply situation. Suppliers have also been pushing to get more visibility into the customers' demand requirements, etc. So it's useful to do that demand management and provide that demand visibility to suppliers. Last thing I would say is ongoing risk assessment of your key suppliers is also very important, so that you have a very good understanding proactively of any financial issues that they may be running into, or supply issues that they may be running into the future. You can get ahead of that by doing that ongoing supply risk assessment. So hopefully that answers the question, Catherine.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much. And we'll just take one final question, and I'll open this up to the group. So quickest buzzer first. With a shorter tail in terms of supply base, but spend being huge, what can we do to bring in saving opportunities? So I think this is focusing around how to manage tail spend in 2022, even if the spend's large, but the supply base is fragmented.
I'll go on that one then, Catherine, if we've got silence. So tail spend, my experience with tail spend is that every organization's tail spend is very different. You probably find that tail spend is quite similar in different industry verticals. So you find that typically financial services organisations have a large tail spend consisting of software, things like that. So, what I tend to find is I try to standardise my approach with the tail spend. Unfortunately, there is no other way than you have to get in and amongst the weeds with the tail spend. You have to really get in there and understand the detail, which for me, it can be quite difficult in some organisations, because typically procurement has a mandate at a certain spend level. So if the tail spend is, there's a long tail of 250 suppliers all transacting below 50k, then perhaps procurement have never even heard of any of those suppliers. It'll all be brand new. So you have to get in and amongst the weeds. And I would recommend splitting the tail into categories. Try to figure out which categories are most appropriate to your organisation's tail. So in a recent one that I worked on, we categorised some of the opportunities suitable to move over to value-added reseller if it was a piece of software, and we created a pipeline to move those bits of software over to the value-added reseller. We also looked for opportunities for extreme demand management, basically just challenging the requirement full stop and saying, is it really necessary? Does it add the value that we really need? There may be opportunities for extreme demand management in your tail. So have a read through the tail and try and figure out which categories you might slot each of the suppliers into, and then take them to your senior leadership team and ask them what they think about how they should address the tail spend. There's typically always a lot of consolidation opportunities in tail spend as well. I've seen instances where organizations are purchasing lots of different types of IT services from a long list of 50 organizations that could all be taken care of by one large managed service provider. So make sure you pay attention to supplier offerings and consolidation as well in the tail.
I'd also add to that as well, it's a perfect opportunity for guided buying, for catalogues, and for really directing that lower value spend into pre-existing framework agreements. So yeah, it's down to policy and governance of that policy as well. I think it's something to be considered across all the commodities. And it's something that there's never-ending developments in technology to help manage that tail spend, but ultimately policy and process are going to decide whether it goes through an automated channel or if it's worth a strategic sourcing review. And I think we are running out of time. Yes, we're almost at 1:30. So thank you very much for joining today. We really appreciate you spending your time listening to us, and I hope you found the sessions interesting. We will share the recordings and also the materials that we've presented today. So thank you very much.